Whatever questions you want me to ask.
We're live. All right, everybody. So we're back again. It is Saturday once more. And so just like the last couple Saturdays, we are going to be doing one of our Minnesota fish species highlight streams here. Also, we have a live audience. We have one brave soul who's come down here on this day before Easter to come watch me talk about fish. Could be more coming. There's a few other guests in the building. Who knows? But before we get started, of course, this is something that we are doing as part of a grant that was we're working with the Audubon Society. And so part of the No Child Left Inside program. It's a program that's meant to get children the bluegills and sunfish and pumpkin seeds. Last week we talked about bass and crappies, or the untrue sunfishes as I was calling them. This week we're talking about actually a group that is a lot bigger than what we typically are going to experience as anglers. Like, we're talking about 3 species here today specifically: sauger, walleye, and the yellow perch. But there's a lot of perches in Minnesota. Most of them are just too small to really be catching while we're fishing. And so perches would include things like all the little darters that you find around out in the lake are also a part of this family. Log perch are part of this family. Trout perch are part of this family. Prominent invasive, the European ruff, is also actually a part of this family, because this is a group that you can find pretty much throughout the entirety of the northern hemisphere. But we're going to focus on 3 species today, because these are the 3 that you're like realistically going to potentially bump into while you're fishing. And like I said, this is a lecture series about fishing. And like I said, we have all of our species, well, most of our species that we can find here in Minnesota prevalent. And some common things that you're going to notice between all of these species of fish, just like we saw with the sunfishes. Hello. Got some folks that came down. Take a seat. We're just getting started. And so, yeah, things that you're going to notice right away, like anytime you pull out a fish out of the lake, there's, these things exist in groups. There's groups of fishes out there, and they're going to have common traits. And so with the perches, one of the things you're immediately looking for is the divided dorsal fin here. And so you can see we have a front part that is kind of spiky, a back part that's kind of soft, which you'll recognize as something that was true for the sunfishes too. The difference here is that with the sunfishes, we had a connected point here, where like you pull your bluegill out and it's one pretty much extended dorsal fin that's kind of pointy in the front and soft in the back. But with these guys, you're getting, like I said, the divide there, and that's sort of the really iconic feature that you're talking about when you're talking about something in the perch family. Torpedo-shaped body, these guys are much more active predators than the sunfishes are, and so those torpedo-shaped bodies are handy, helps them swim faster, helps them catch food. You'll find that most of these guys have pretty sharp teeth too, perch kind of being the exception. But yeah, and the forked tail as well. Alright, let's talk about the yellow perch. One of my favorites, honestly. One that you can find kind of throughout the lakes. You'll see them a lot in like the shallows. Like, this is a fish that, we talked about the bluegill as sort of the iconic like first fish for people to catch. Perch are pretty much right up there too, because you're going to catch perch in pretty much the same areas that you're going to catch things like the bluegills and pumpkin seeds and all this stuff that we're used to just, throwing a bobber and worm off the dock, and a lot of times you're going to pull a perch out. But these guys are ones that you can, like I said, find throughout the lakes, and specifically the bigger ones you can find out a little bit more in open water. And again, if we're identifying a perch, the easiest thing to look for, yellowish color, and then sort of the tiger stripes on the back, black tiger stripes on the back that you're seeing with the perch here. And one, in my opinion, kind of underrated thing that really like makes the perch stand out is the orange fins. Like, that's the thing that I've always thought was a really striking feature about this fish, that, like I said, people talk about the stripes and the color, not so much the orange fins. But yeah, and they're going to jump out right away as far as like the stuff you're catching off the dock, just because like very different shape. Like I said, a bluegill, it's shaped like a pan. They're round. It's the reason they call them panfish. These guys are going to be a little bit longer and thinner. And for fishing for them, you'll catch some really, really tiny perch. One of the things we talked about with the bluegills and sunfish is that they're very limited just by like the size of their mouths. Like, they can't catch very much food because their mouths are so little that they can't like get around a hook a lot of the times. With the perch, their mouths open quite a bit bigger, so you'll catch little perch that are, you know, this long because they can just barely manage to get that hook inside their mouth. And so some of the smallest fish you're likely to catch are going to be perch. And when you're looking for the little ones, like I said, fish for them like you're fishing for a bluegill or a pumpkin seed like that. Throw a bobber down by a weed line and you'll catch perch. You're not going to catch very many little ones out in open water. Like I said, just the same way that we were talking about with the pumpkin seeds and whatnot, just because that's where the big fish are and that's who's looking to eat these guys. As far as the bigger ones, now we're talking about going out into a little bit more openish type of areas. The one thing that's really true about perch, and this is something you'll experience as far as any time you're fishing for them, is they're very prone to they like to move around in big schools, basically. And so you're sort of prone to runs with perches where you'll hit them really hard for a little while if you're out there in open water, and then all of a sudden, like, poof, they're gone. So the typical like perch fishing thing is you're moving around a bunch, especially when you're ice fishing. You're dropping a bunch of holes in, you're testing, you're moving around a ton. But when you're on a boat, you're sort of doing the same thing. You're looking for 10, 15 feet of water, looking for a weed line, dragging around outside the weed line, and you'll find honestly lots of stuff that way. But if you're looking for like bigger perch in open water, that's the way that you're going to do it. They tend to sit pretty low in the water column, generally the bigger perch. And mostly what they're eating is smaller fish. That tends to be what they target. So like I said, this is again different from things like pumpkin seeds and bluegills where they're mostly eating insects and other invertebrate larvae. These guys, like I said, because they have that little bit bigger mouth, they're actually able to target other fish a little bit more effectively. And so that tends to be what they go for. And unlike some fish, perch actually stay very, very active in the winter. And so ice fishing for perch is something that a lot of people do a lot. And like honestly, when I'm ice fishing, this is usually what I'm going for is perch, just because I really enjoy the meat from them. It's probably my favorite fish to eat. And again, you can catch a lot of them, so they're pretty fun to fish for, in my opinion. And again, even more so than when you're in open water, be prepared for like boom and bust cycles when you're fishing for perch, where, like I said, you'll drop a hole down there, you'll hit them hard for an hour, and then all of a sudden you won't see another one for 2 hours, and it's just because the school came through and it kept on moving, basically. And like most stuff in the winter, they just tend to move into a little bit deeper water. One of the things you'll sometimes experience with perch, if you're fishing for them, especially through the ice, because you're fishing in a little bit deeper water, is you'll pull them out and there'll be like a thing in their mouth. Maybe some of you guys, if you ever fish, have experienced this. They'll have like a pink kind of blob thing in their mouth. And that's a product of the depth that they're existing in. So what can happen sometimes, especially with perch, I find it's very prevalent, is if you pull them up too fast, their swim bladders expand and come into their mouth. And supposedly, you just throw them back in the water and they are able to recalibrate and get it back down. And supposedly it's not a fatal thing for them. I don't know, it seems pretty dramatic whenever it happens, but supposedly it's fine. But it's something like, be prepared to like notice that. And it's one of those things where like when you're looking at like fishing forums of like people who are new getting into perch, they're like, I keep pulling up these perch and they have these weird things in their mouth. Are these okay to eat? Like, yeah, it's fine. They're, like I said, it's their swim bladder. It's pressure differential. The gases expand. It pops out of their mouth. So if you happen to notice that, don't worry, it's fine. But yeah, and again, just like pretty much everything that you're fishing for in the winter, you're jigging for them. And so jigging entails basically dropping a line straight down into the water column, weighted usually with some sort of specific bait on the end. Typically it's live bait. With perch, typically you're using minnows is the often associated bait with them, as opposed to something like leeches or worms or anything like that. Let's talk sauger. So sauger are a fish that, personally, I don't think I've ever deliberately fished for sauger. I know some people who do and have. It tends to not happen a ton in Minnesota, but we do have them in Minnesota. When people fish for sauger, it tends to be something they tend to do further north of here. It's more of a Canadian thing in my experience, is fishing for sauger. And so sauger, functionally, like, again, if you're like looking for information about sauger online, like the information that you the websites you're going to encounter are going to be a million different things that are like, how do you tell the difference between a sauger and a walleye? And so it's just highlighting all these different physical features of them. And specifically, like, again, the thing I always learned when telling the difference between a sauger and a walleye is to look at the tip of the tail. Walleye have like sort of a white little spot on the bottom tip of that tail, whereas sauger don't have that. They have sort of a line. The other thing that I've always liked to use is if you look at the membrane between the spines on the fins, saugers have black spots all throughout their membrane. Like it's clear in between, but it's like these black spots. And so if you pull that up and you find them, you got a sauger. The other tricky part about this is, like a lot of the fish that we've been talking about, they can hybridize with other stuff, and walleye and sauger can also hybridize, so you'll get some kind of weird looking ones sometimes. The pattern you're seeing on the side here, where there's some sort of dark splotchy stuff, is another sauger thing, but again, that's one of those things where I tend to find that it shows well when you're comparing a sauger and a walleye directly, but when you pull just an isolated sauger out, it's not that useful. It's hard to tell with that, in my opinion. But yeah, and I say they're probably the least likely to encounter in Minnesota because they tend to live in a little bit deeper water than what a lot of people tend to fish for. They occupy kind of similar habitats to walleyes, but like I said, usually 10, 15 feet deeper. And so occasionally you'll bump into them while you're fishing for walleyes is basically my experience. But yeah, the issue they run into as far as like being an appealing target for fishing is they're like walleyes, except they're smaller, so you're less likely to like be able to get good ones to eat. And also they're in deeper water and harder to fish for. So like the benefit of it is people fish for them for like the novelty, it seems like, is the kind of exclusive reason people do it. But they're really associated with these deep, dark holes, with especially moving water. So like the thing you'll have them very associated with is dams. Like go on where a dam, like opposite side of a dam, drop into a deep hole with, you know, this muddy, gross, turned up bottom and just start dropping baits down there. And I don't know, maybe you'll bump into them. I've never, like I said, I don't know anybody who actually targets sauger, but this is what you're supposedly supposed to do, is just drop a really big, heavy weight down to the bottom and try and just bounce it off the bottom and hope they hit. Supposedly they're very voracious eaters. Supposedly they'll attack on pretty much anything that like comes into their space. But yeah, I don't know, I've never had a whole lot of luck like finding them. And they're not very active in the winter, it seems like. Again, it's one of those things where like I don't even know if I know anybody who has ever ice fished for them, compared to like perch and walleye that people obviously ice fish for a lot. I think they're a cool fish. I think they're very interesting, but like from a fishing perspective, honestly, like there's just not a whole lot of info out there on them, and I don't have a lot of personal experience with them, so it's hard for me to really advocate for them as a fishing target. And then of course we have the walleye. The largest of this group that we have in Minnesota. Also the probably most commonly targeted, not just fish, but probably game animal in general in Minnesota. Minnesota's state fish, of course. And they're named after, of course, their eyes, which you can see right there. Let me get a better picture of the eye? A little bit. And so, the thing about walleyes that it makes them really unique to fish for is that they have really, really, really good vision for a fish. They are able to see very well compared to other fish. And the reason for that is because, again, they have this very unique eye that they are named after, where we have an extra reflective layer, basically, on the back of the eye. And so what happens is they're able to take light into their eye, which is the same thing we do, where we get light into our eye, and that's what lets us see. But with walleyes, because they have this mirrored layer on the back of the eye, the light actually gets bounced back through from behind as well. And so they're able to basically make use of the light that they get twice. And so it lets them sit in this little bit deeper, darker water and still be able to see really well. And so what you'll find is that when you're fishing for walleyes, what you're looking for, sort of weirdly, is times when visibility is bad. Like when you're targeting walleyes, like you're usually Like they're sort of associated as being a night bite, where it's a dawn to dusk kind of when you're targeting them. They're associated with really like bad weather, you know, overcast, rainy, windy. The walleye chop is, of course, the term you've probably heard, where you're looking for like 15-degree winds and like sputtery, stormy kind of weather. And the reason for that is because like when visibility is low, is when they're like at their most advantageous position. They can see better in those types of conditions than anybody else, so they go out and they do their hunting then. Well, you know, the log perch and whatever are busy struggling not to get swept away by the choppy water. The walleyes are out there just having a heyday because they're not too perturbed by it. Similar to the perch, they tend to operate in pretty large schools of similar sized individuals of the same species. So if you, again, happen to find a pile of walleyes, you'll sit down there and you'll pull 16-inch walleye after 16-inch walleye out of the same hole until they're not there anymore, basically, and then you got to move on. Tends to be how it works. A little bit deeper than what anybody else we've really talked about other than sauger tend to hang out. You'll catch them every once in a while when you're fishing for smallmouth bass. It tends to be when I sort of catch them by accident, where you're fishing in like 15, 20, 25 feet of water. Especially in like the later part of the fishing season, like right before ice out. Like I said, I'll catch them every once in a while I'm fishing for smallies because they're in a little bit shallower water with the smallies. But in the summer, they tend to hang out deeper. And what you see is that these guys, a lot of fish are very motivated by like temperature as far as like where they're going to be in the water column. Walleye, and this is also true for sauger, are kind of unique in that they seemingly are more motivated by light conditions. So in the deeper the water is able to penetrate in the water column, the deeper they go because they're trying to be in areas where there's not much light. And so, like I said, when conditions are bad, when water is cloudy, when they tend to move into a little bit shallower water and get a little bit more active because you don't have or light penetrating as deep into the water column. And then when you're actually like looking for, you know, you got your fish finder out, you're, you know, mapping the bottom of the lake as you're going, look for areas where you have like shallow water near deep water, and they'll usually be cruising up and down that like sort of transition zone in between the shallow and the deep water, and they'll move up and down there throughout the day, basically, like I said, associated with the light and where the food is. And then as far as ice fishing goes, they do take a little bit of a hit as far as their activity in the winter. They're not quite as active when it comes to eating. And this is pretty much true for all fish. Some are dramatically more affected than others. Walleye more so than like perch, seemingly. And the reason this stuff gets less active in the winter is because these are animals that are cold-blooded. And so when they're cold-blooded, their metabolism slows down. They don't need to eat as much, so they tend not to feed as actively. They also just tend not to move around as much because they're, again, seemingly very motivated by like amount of light in the water, and when there's 2 feet of ice on top of the water plus a pile of snow, the light factor isn't as important for them. Again, associated very much with being a night bite, maybe even more so in the winter. And basically you're looking for the most shiny, reflective, visible jigs you can is, again, typically what you associate with fishing for walleyes. And then again, minnows. People use leeches for them too, I know, is a bait that a lot of people use when they're looking for walleyes. I've pretty much always used minnows, but I know a lot of people do prefer to use leeches for them. And again, similar thing, just drop down an extra 10, 15 feet from where you would try and hit them in the summer and fall. And I also want to talk briefly here about sort of management stuff for walleyes. Walleyes are a really interesting species because they are so heavily targeted by fishermen. It makes it so that like the DNR has to do a lot of very specific stuff sort of centered around walleyes and how they exist in Minnesota. Like I said, they're the most heavily targeted game species in Minnesota. Not just fish, any species. There's more people out there fishing for walleyes. There's more walleye taken out of the environment every year than there are things like deer or grouse or ducks or any of these other things that people like to try and harvest from the wild. And a lot of the like conservation efforts around them centers around what would be called the Big Ten lakes in Minnesota. And so we can see I got a map here with all of them. And you can see a lot of them are actually pretty close to Bemidji. Like Bemidji is right here. This is Bemidji. And so you can see we got Red very close to us here, you know, what, 45 minutes north of us maybe. Cass is here, so that's 20 minutes away. Winnie, Leech here, all sort of in very close proximity to Bemidji. And then just like broader in the north, I mean, we got Lake of the Woods, we got Rainy Lake, we got, this is Vermilion, this is Mille Lacs, and then this is Lake Pepin down here is the one that's sort of the outlier, and then it's down in the southern part of the state. But yeah, and the sort of the qualification for being one of the big 10 walleye lakes is an expected annual harvest of 100,000 pounds of walleye or more. In the case of Red Lake, I think the average is more in the like 400-ish thousand pounds taken out of there per year. And that's down from like sort of historical levels because, you know, recently over the last 30-ish or so years, most of these lakes have experienced like pretty dramatic crashes in their walleye population because of overharvesting. Red Lake, very famously, back in the like mid to late 90s, pretty much had their entire walleye population wiped out because of commercial fisheries on the lake. Mille Lacs to this day is like proven to be kind of a conundrum as far as actual walleye population. They've been working on trying to get Mille Lacs straightened out forever. Lake of the Woods had a pretty dramatic population crash in the early 2000s as well. And so, like I said, because of overharvesting, and so because of like this thing that was like constantly happening, you know, Lake of the Woods had a crash in the 80s, and then they crashed again in the early 2000s, and we saw crashes in pretty much all the ones out on the Leech Lake Reservation out here. These three all crashed in the early 2000s as well. As I'd read in the 90s, Vermilion in the early 2000s. Like I said, Mille Lacs for the last 20 years. And so there's a ton of effort that goes into just like maintaining this population. Stocking efforts, of course, are something that gets done. I was looking something up for Lake Vermilion, and I saw, I think it was 2020 or 2021, they stocked 4.5 million walleyes in Lake Vermilion alone. And then Vermilion is not the biggest of those lakes. Like, they probably put more in Lake of the Woods or Red or any of these other little bit bigger ones even. So that's like a huge scale operation, you know, breeding and stocking that many fish. Slot and bag limits, so you'll see, like I was just up on red fishing a couple months ago, and it's like you can take one walleye that's over 16 inches long, and then you have a bag limit between 11 and 16 is basically how it works, where basically what they're trying to do is prevent people from taking the like breeding age walleye out of the population, so that they can maintain the population that way. One of the other things that happens a lot is both on a like government like DNR endorsed side and also like just people generally kind of going out and doing their own thing, is species that are perceived as being like detrimental to walleye populations tend to get very heavily targeted as well. The DNR for cormorants specifically, which are a bird that eats a lot of small fish, but they hire hunters to go out and just harvest as many cormorants as they can, basically. Again, I was reading a news article, I think it was for Leech, where it was talking to two guys that the DNR had contracted out to hunt cormorants, and they were like, yeah, we're expecting to take about 1,500 cormorants this year, just going out there with their shotguns. How effective is that type of policy actually? Good question. Most of the evidence seems to speak for cormorants targeting things like perch a lot more heavily than they target walleyes, because they tend to hang out in the shallows a lot more. But like I said, they have this perception, though, as being problematic for walleye populations, and so they get targeted as such, because a lot of what the DNR does when it comes to fisheries is very walleye-centric, because they're so heavily targeted by anglers. And I mentioned couple talks ago when we were talking about rock bass, I talked about how I remember people when I was a kid would kill rock bass whenever they would catch them because they are perceived as eating walleye eggs and smallmouth bass. And as they have this perception, they get targeted as well. But yeah, and I guess that's part of sort of the broader thing here when it comes to walleye specifically, is like I said, the DNR is working all the time to sort of maintain these like healthy environments for people to be able to go out and interact with. But it's worth thinking about, like, how do we define what a healthy environment is? Because in Minnesota, when it comes to care for water, a healthy environment basically is in a lot of ways seemingly deemed to be a fishery that is able to produce a lot of walleyes. Lake of the Woods actually is a very interesting one in this regard as well, where because it's an international body of water, it has shoreline both in Ontario and in Minnesota. You can see reports from both governments on it, and it's interestingly enough, like, Minnesota deems Lake of the Woods to be like a pretty healthy lake when it comes to the walleye fishery, but for Ontario, it's deemed a like very, very unhealthy lake. It's deemed to be like a very problematic lake, like low population lake, which is interesting. Like, is that a product of differing data that they're getting on either side of their lakefront, or is it a problem of, you know, the way that we're defining what healthy is on either side of it? Hard to say, because they don't like sharing data with each other very much, but as I said, it was an interesting thing I was noticing while I was kind of looking up the relative health of all these lakes, is that Ontario thinks Lake of the Woods is in really bad shape. Minnesota thinks it's in pretty good shape, and they have been fighting about that for a while. But anyway, I think that's my last slide. Yep. So, thank you guys, my live audience. Thank you. Thank you guys, my less live audience, my internet audience over here. A couple of you on there, I see. But yeah, we're going to keep doing these shows every weekend. Like I said, we're basically highlighting a group of fish every Saturday. We're doing, like I said, shooting for 20 minutes or so for each of these little talks. Let's see. Who do I want to talk about next week? I haven't decided yet, actually. April, what's a spring bite? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about northerns and muskies next week. That'll be the one we talk about next week. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'm gonna shut the stream down. If you guys have any questions, feel free.